In 1889, a queen bit into a piece of bread that no one in her circle would have touched with gloved hands. Margherita of Savoy, queen consort of the newly unified Kingdom of Italy, was visiting Naples, a city the northern Italian aristocracy viewed the way you might view a beautiful house with a rat problem. Gorgeous, sure, but not somewhere you'd eat the street food. And yet, according to the story that's been passed down for over a century, a local baker named Raffaele Esposito prepared 3 flatbreads for her, one topped with garlic, one with anchovies, and one, the simplest of the 3, dressed in tomato, mozzarella, and fresh basil. Red, white, and green, the colors of the new Italian flag. The queen, supposedly, loved it. Now, whether that story is perfectly true or partly legend, and historians have real doubts about the details, what matters is what it reveals. The fact that anyone even remembers this moment tells you something enormous about what pizza was before it. It was so low, so beneath the dignity of polite Italian society, that a queen tasting it was considered newsworthy. Not because the food was exotic, because it was shameful. This is the part that doesn't make sense to us now. Pizza is arguably the most recognized food on the planet. Americans alone spend somewhere north of $46 billion a year on it. There are more pizza restaurants in the United States than there are bank branches. You can get a slice at an airport in Tokyo, a train station in Sao Paulo, a gas station in rural Oklahoma. It is everywhere. It is ordinary. It is, for a lot of people, the single most comforting food in existence. But for most of its history, pizza was none of those things. It was the food of the poor. Not poor the way we sometimes romanticize it, rustic, simple, noble. Poor the way that actually looks, desperate, crowded, and invisible to anyone with money. The people who ate pizza in 18th century Naples were the lazzaroni, a class of working poor so low on the social ladder that visitors to the city described them the way you'd describe stray animals. They lived in one-room dwellings. They worked the docks. And they ate this cheap, fast, portable flatbread because it was the only thing they could afford that didn't require a kitchen, a table, or time they didn't have. Italian intellectuals were disgusted by it. Northern Italians wanted nothing to do with it. Travel writers from France and England described Neapolitan pizza vendors the way a food critic today might describe someone selling mystery meat from a shopping cart. One Italian dictionary from the period defined pizza simply as a type of cake, as if even naming it properly would give it too much dignity. The food that would eventually become Italy's most famous cultural export was something that educated Italians actively tried to pretend didn't exist. So how did it get from there to here? How did a survival food scraped together by the poorest people in one of Europe's most neglected cities become a global industry worth over $150 billion? How did something Italy was ashamed of become the thing Italy is most known for? That story involves a volcanic eruption, a queen's maybe fictional lunch, a wave of desperate emigrants who carried the recipe across an ocean, the worst slums in American history, a world war that changed what soldiers were willing to eat, a Michigan mother who turned her living room into a franchise empire, and a chemical innovation that most people have never heard of but that quietly changed the way the entire planet consumes food. And it starts, like a lot of food stories do, not with a recipe, but with hunger. The Bay of Naples sits in the shadow of Vesuvius. That volcano made the surrounding soil extraordinarily fertile, rich in minerals, loose, dark, the kind of earth where tomatoes and grain practically grow themselves. But fertile land doesn't mean prosperous people. For centuries, Naples was one of the most densely populated cities in Europe and also one of its poorest. By the 1700s, it had swelled past 300,000 residents, many of them crammed into the narrow streets of the Spanish Quarter and the waterfront slums near the port. These were the lazzaroni, a class of people so poor that most of them had no fixed employment, no permanent shelter, and no reliable way to feed a family. They picked up day labor at the docks, hauled fish, swept streets, begged. And they needed food that was 3 things at once: cheap, fast, and filling enough to keep a body moving through a day of physical work. Flatbread solved that problem. Flour and water, stretched thin, baked on the stones of outdoor ovens that lined the alleyways. Street vendors sold it folded in half, sometimes for as little as a few granny, the smallest copper coins in the Neapolitan economy. You could eat it walking. You didn't need a plate, a table, a kitchen. You didn't even need teeth in particularly good shape because the dough was soft. Here's what matters. This was not food that anyone with money would touch. Not because it tasted bad, but because of who ate it and where they ate it. The lazzaroni were considered barely human by the Neapolitan upper classes. Foreign travelers who visited Naples in the 18th century wrote about them with a mixture of fascination and open disgust. Goethe passed through in 1787 and described the street life with a kind of detached curiosity, but other writers were less generous. One French traveler called the lazzaroni the filth of Europe. Their food inherited that stigma. And this is the part most people never learn about. When tomatoes finally entered the picture, sometime in the late 1700s, after spending 2 centuries being treated as a suspicious, possibly poisonous New World ornament, they didn't arrive on the tables of the wealthy first. Wealthy Neapolitans avoided them. Tomatoes showed up in the streets, mashed onto flatbread by vendors who recognized that a smear of cooked tomato added flavor and moisture to plain dough for almost no cost. The combination, dough, tomato, maybe a bit of lard or cheap cheese, became the prototype of what we'd recognize as pizza. Even the word carried contempt. Pizza likely comes from an old Italian term related to pinching or pulling dough, and for a long time it referred to any number of rough-baked things. It wasn't a cuisine, it wasn't a tradition anyone celebrated. It was just what poor people ate, because they couldn't afford anything else. The dish that would one day become arguably the most recognized food on the planet, the thing that would generate more annual revenue than the entire recorded music industry, was born as an embarrassment, a class marker, the culinary equivalent of wearing rags, and the embarrassment ran deep. When the Kingdom of Italy unified in 1861, the new nation's educated northern elites looked at Naples and saw backwardness. They saw disease, overcrowding, superstition, and a population that ate with its hands in the street. Pizza was part of that image, proof, in their eyes, that the South was uncivilized. Government officials, journalists, northern Italian intellectuals, many of them openly wished that pizza, and everything it represented, would simply disappear as Italy modernized. It did not disappear. It did something far stranger. It waited. And while it waited, something happened across the Atlantic that would change its fate entirely. Between roughly 1880 and 1920, 4 million Italians left for the United States. The vast majority came from the South, from Campania, Calabria, Sicily, the exact regions where pizza lived in the streets. They carried almost nothing with them, but they carried the recipe. What happened next is one of those collisions between two worlds that neither side saw coming. The Italian immigrants who arrived in New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, and a handful of other American cities didn't walk into open arms. They walked into suspicion. They were crowded into tenement buildings on the Lower East Side, in East Harlem, in neighborhoods so dense that a single apartment might hold 3 families sleeping in shifts. They were called dirty. They were called criminal. Newspapers ran cartoons depicting them as subhuman. Help-wanted signs carried that familiar poison, "No Italians need apply." And in the middle of all that, they did what displaced people have always done. They cooked what they knew. The first pizzerias in America weren't restaurants in any way you'd recognize. They were basement operations, side alley stalls, sometimes just a woman with a coal oven in the back of a tenement selling slices through a window to workers heading to the docks before sunrise. The customers were almost exclusively other Italians. Nobody else wanted the stuff. To mainstream America in the early 1900s, pizza was foreign, suspicious, vaguely alarming, a greasy disk of dough smeared with tomato and eaten without utensils by people who didn't speak English. It sat in the same cultural category as 100 other immigrant foods that native-born Americans treated with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains everything that follows. The very thing that made pizza shameful in Italy, its cheapness, its speed, the fact that you could eat it standing up with one hand, turned out to be exactly what a new country full of factory workers and 12-hour shifts actually needed. It was fast. It was filling. It cost almost nothing to produce, and it tasted frankly extraordinary, because the combination of bread, fat, acid, and salt hits every reward center the human palate has. Pizza didn't need a marketing campaign. It needed a population that was hungry, broke, and short on time. which is precisely what early 20th century industrial America provided. So while the old country still treated pizza as a peasant relic, something you'd never serve at a respectable table in Rome or Milan, the new country was quietly turning it into a survival engine. Gennaro Lombardi is usually credited with opening the first licensed pizzeria in the United States, on Spring Street in Manhattan, around 1905. The details are debated. Some historians argue the license was for a general grocery, and the pizza came later. But what's not debated is the pattern. Within a decade, small pizzerias started appearing across Italian-American neighborhoods. They weren't fancy, most had no menus. You got a pie, or you got a slice, and you ate it on a wooden counter, or on the sidewalk, and it cost a nickel. This is where the story splits into two tracks, and you need to hold both of them to understand what comes later. In the Italian-American communities, pizza was becoming a kind of anchor. It was familiar. It was the taste of home in a country that didn't want you. Mothers made it on Sundays. Pizzerias became gathering places, not just for food, but for news, for gossip, for the slow, painful work of building a community when the larger society wished you'd go back where you came from. The food carried emotional weight far beyond its ingredients. Outside those communities, almost nobody cared. Pizza remained invisible to mainstream American culture for decades. It didn't appear in cookbooks. It wasn't served in non-Italian restaurants. Major newspapers barely mentioned it. As late as the 1930s, you could live your entire life in most American cities and never encounter a slice. Two worlds, separated by a few blocks and an ocean of prejudice. The Italian grandmother pulling dough in a Brooklyn kitchen and the American housewife flipping through a cookbook full of meatloaf and casseroles might as well have existed on different planets. That might have been the end of the story. Pizza as a permanent ethnic niche, loved fiercely by one community, ignored by everyone else, slowly fading as the children and grandchildren assimilated and stopped speaking Italian and moved to the suburbs and forgot. But then something happened that no food historian could have predicted, something that had nothing to do with recipes or restaurants or anyone's grandmother. The United States went to war. In 1942 and 43, hundreds of thousands of American GIs, kids from Iowa, from Texas, from small towns in Georgia, where the most exotic food was chili, shipped out to North Africa, and then crossed the Mediterranean into Sicily. And in Sicily, in the bombed-out villages and the makeshift camps, and the cramped trattorias that somehow stayed open through the shelling, they ate pizza. Real pizza. Thin, charred, draped in tomato and whatever cheese could be scrounged. They ate it because it was cheap. They ate it because it was there, and then something unexpected happened. They loved it. Not in the polite way you appreciate a foreign curiosity. They loved it the way you love something that feels like it was always missing from your life. Letters home mentioned it. Soldiers talked about it in mess halls. When the campaign moved north through the Italian mainland, Naples, Rome, the long grinding push, pizza followed them, or rather they followed it, seeking it out in every town. This was not a small thing. Millions of young American men, from every background, every region, every class, discovered the same food, at the same time, under the most intense circumstances a person can experience. War does that. It strips away the ordinary filters. You don't care that something is ethnic or low class when you're 20 years old and exhausted and scared and someone hands you something hot and good. And then the war ended and they came home. You have to picture the scale. Between 1945 and 1947, over 12 million American servicemen returned to civilian life. They moved to new suburbs built on old farmland. They married. They started families. And a significant number of them, nobody knows exactly how many, but enough to change the trajectory of an entire food, came home wanting pizza. The demand appeared almost overnight, and it appeared everywhere, not just in New York or New Haven or the old Italian neighborhoods. It appeared in places that had never seen a pizzeria. Returning veterans in Phoenix, in Minneapolis, in Dallas walked into restaurants and asked for pizza, and the restaurants had no idea what they were talking about. This is the part most people never learn about. Pizza's explosion in America wasn't driven by Italian immigrants pushing their culture outward. It was driven by non-Italian Americans pulling it toward them. The GIs didn't just tolerate pizza, they evangelized it. They opened their own pizzerias, sometimes with no Italian heritage at all. working from memory and improvisation, trying to recreate something they'd tasted in a bombed village 6,000 miles away. The numbers tell the story more clearly than anything else. In 1945, there were a few hundred pizzerias in the United States, almost all of them in Italian neighborhoods on the East Coast. By 1955, there were more than 20,000, scattered across every state. That growth had no precedent in American food history. Nothing had ever moved that fast. And the pizza those new shops served barely resembled what a Neapolitan street vendor would have recognized. It couldn't, because the conditions were completely different. In Naples, a pizzaiolo worked a wood-fired oven built from volcanic brick, using a dough that had fermented slowly in the coastal humidity, topped with San Marzano tomatoes grown in the mineral-rich soil below Vesuvius. In a strip mall outside Cleveland, a veteran-turned-owner had a gas oven, a bag of all-purpose flour, and a can of Hunt's tomato sauce. So they adapted, and in adapting, they invented. The crust got thicker in some places, thinner in others. Cheese went from a scattering of fresh mozzarella to a heavy blanket of the low-moisture kind, the sort that came pre-shredded in 5-pound bags and stretched into those long strings Americans would come to consider the entire point. Toppings multiplied. Pepperoni, a meat that doesn't even exist in Italy, became the signature American topping, a spiced salami variant created by Italian-American butchers who were themselves improvising with local ingredients. Regional styles fractured almost immediately. In Chicago, Ike Sewell and Rick Ricardo, one of them not Italian at all, opened Pizzeria Uno in 1943 and started serving something that looked more like a casserole than a flatbread. The deep dish was baked in a high-walled pan, loaded with cheese and chunky tomato sauce layered in reverse order, the sauce on top. A Neapolitan would have stared at it the way a French chef might stare at a cheeseburger, but Chicagoans loved it, fiercely, the way you love something that belongs to your city alone. In New Haven, Frank Pepe's a pizza, the word itself a dialect pronunciation, kept the char and the thin crust closer to something an old country baker might have nodded at, but topped it with clams, a local New England twist that would have baffled anyone south of Rome. In Detroit, they started baking pizza in the rectangular blue steel pans that auto workers had originally used to hold small parts on the assembly line. The result was a thick, airy, almost focaccia-like square, with caramelized cheese edges, a style born entirely from industrial accident and local resourcefulness. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains everything about what pizza was becoming. None of these regional inventors were trying to be authentic. Authenticity wasn't the goal. Satisfaction was. They were feeding factory workers, college students, families with 4 kids and $12 for dinner. Pizza was becoming the great American democratic food precisely because nobody owned it. No protected recipe, no guild, no centuries-old institution insisting on the right way. Anybody with a hot oven and enough nerve could open a shop and call what came out of it pizza. And then the franchise model arrived, and everything accelerated beyond what even the most optimistic pizzeria owner could have predicted. In 1958, 2 brothers named Dan and Frank Carney borrowed $600 from their mother and opened a small pizza restaurant in Wichita, Kansas. They called it Pizza Hut. The building had room for 25 seats. Within a decade, the chain had hundreds of locations. By the mid-70s, it had gone international. Tom Monahan bought a struggling pizza shop in Ypsilanti, Michigan in 1960, eventually renamed it Domino's, and built the entire business around a single radical promise: delivery in 30 minutes or less. He didn't sell pizza so much as sell speed. The pizza was a vehicle for the convenience. Little Caesars, Papa John's, Round Table, each chain stripped away another layer of the craft tradition, replacing the pizzaiolo's hands with standardized dough balls shipped frozen from a central commissary, replacing the wood-fired oven with a conveyor belt that moved pies through a gas tunnel at a calibrated speed. A Domino's pizza in Tucson tasted exactly like a Domino's pizza in Tampa. By the early 1980s, Americans were eating roughly 75 acres of pizza every single day. Sit with that number. 75 acres. Larger than most farms in the Midwest. And nearly all of it was coming not from some old Neapolitan baker dusting flour off his apron, but from assembly lines, commissary kitchens, and delivery drivers racing against a ticking clock. The franchise model did something no single pizzeria ever could have. It turned pizza into infrastructure. Pizza Hut alone had more than 4,000 locations in the United States by 1985, and it was already pushing into markets that would have baffled Gennaro Lombardi. Tokyo, Sao Paulo, Riyadh. Domino's was opening a new store somewhere on the planet roughly every other day. The food that Neapolitan grandmothers had folded and eaten standing in the street was now being assembled by teenagers wearing headsets and polyester visors under fluorescent lights. And the ingredient itself changed. Not just the process, the actual cheese, the actual sauce, the actual dough. Industrial mozzarella replaced fresh buffalo milk curds. It was engineered to melt in a specific way, to brown at a specific temperature, to stretch for the camera in television commercials without snapping. Sauce was no longer crushed San Marzano tomatoes. It arrived in plastic bags from concentrate, sweetened slightly to match the American palate. The crust got thinner in some chains, thicker and chewier in others, stuffed with cheese, folded over, injected with garlic butter. Every permutation tested in focus groups and rolled out market by market. Pizza stopped being a recipe, it became a platform. You could put anything on it. Barbecue chicken, pineapple, jalapenos and cream cheese. A chain in Japan offered squid ink and shrimp. Another in South Korea topped it with sweet potato mousse. None of this had anything to do with Naples. None of it would have been recognized by the lazzaroni, who once ate their flatbread folded in half while leaning against a crumbling wall. But all of it was called pizza, and all of it sold. This is where the story loops back on itself in a way that borders on comedy. Italy watched all of this happen. Italian food writers, Italian chefs, Italian cultural commentators. They watched the Americans take this thing that Italy had been quietly ashamed of for over a century and turn it into the most consumed food on earth. The reaction was not pride. At least at first, it was horror. There is a reason the Italian government eventually stepped in. In 1984, a group of Neapolitan pizza makers formed the Associazione Verace Pizza Napoletana, the true Neapolitan Pizza Association, with rules so specific they bordered on the obsessive. The dough had to be hand-kneaded or mixed at low speed. It could rise for no less than 8 hours. The oven had to be wood-fired, domed, and reach a floor temperature of at least 750 degrees Fahrenheit. The pizza could bake for no longer than 90 seconds. Only San Marzano tomatoes. Only fior di latte, or buffalo mozzarella. Only fresh basil, extra virgin olive oil, and sea salt. They were drawing a line in the flour, so to speak. This is real pizza. Everything else is something else. The European Union eventually backed them up. In 2009, the Pizza Napoletana received a traditional specialty guaranteed certification, a legal designation that meant you could not call your pizza a true Neapolitan unless you followed those exact rules, verified by inspectors, documented and stamped. But here is what makes that whole effort so beautifully contradictory. The thing they were protecting, the thing they were building legal walls around, was street food, the meal of people who could not afford a table. The lazzaroni didn't have certification boards. They had hunger, and a few cents, and a guy with a portable oven on the corner of a narrow alley that smelled like wood smoke and sewage. The idea that this food now required government-approved inspectors, and EU legal stamps, and temperature readings precise to the degree would have been incomprehensible to anyone eating pizza in Naples in 1850. And yet, you understand why they did it. Because by the early 2000s, pizza had become so universal, so pulled apart, and rebuilt by every culture that touched it, that the original was genuinely at risk of being forgotten. Not diluted, forgotten. A kid in Tokyo could eat pizza every week of his life and never once taste anything that resembled what came out of a Neapolitan oven. A family in Chicago could order pizza every Friday for a decade and never encounter a crust that had been touched by human hands. The word had detached from the thing. This is what happens when a food succeeds beyond anyone's imagination. It stops belonging to the place that made it. Italy's relationship with that reality is complicated. On one hand, pizza is now the single food most associated with Italian identity worldwide. More than pasta, more than risotto, more than any regional dish from Tuscany or Emilia-Romagna that Italian food writers would probably prefer you think of first. Pizza is the ambassador, whether the embassy likes it or not. On the other hand, the pizza the world knows is overwhelmingly not Italian. It is American, or it is some local adaptation inspired by the American version. The global pizza industry, worth well over $150 billion a year, is dominated by American chains, American frozen brands, American delivery apps. Domino's alone operates in more than 90 countries. Pizza Hut is in over 100. The Italian share of the global pizza economy is, by comparison, a rounding error. So Italy finds itself in this strange position, celebrated worldwide for a food it once despised, that was reinvented by its poorest immigrants in a country that barely considered them white, and that now generates more revenue for American corporations in a single quarter than the entire Neapolitan pizza sector produces in a year. I mean, think about that for a second. The food that was too low-class for the Italian government to acknowledge in the 19th century is now the subject of Italian government-certified legal protections in the 21st, not because Italy changed its mind about pizza, but because the rest of the world forced the conversation. Italy didn't come back to pizza out of affection. It came back because pizza had become so big, so inescapable, so thoroughly identified with Italy in the global imagination, that ignoring it was no longer an option. That is perhaps the most ironic chapter in this entire story. The country that spent centuries treating pizza as an embarrassment eventually realized it had no choice but to claim it, and the legal counteroffensive, the certification boards, the EU stamps, the temperature mandates, was not just culinary pride. It was an act of reclamation by a country watching the rest of the world run away with something it had barely bothered to hold on to. Because by the 1980s, the word pizza had been so thoroughly absorbed into the global vocabulary that it meant almost anything. A frozen disc with rubbery cheese in a Minnesota supermarket was pizza. A stuffed crust monstrosity dripping with ranch dressing was pizza. A gas station slice reheated under a heat lamp for 6 hours was pizza. And every single one of those products traded on the implicit promise of Italian authenticity, without a single cent flowing back to Naples, without a single nod to the tradition that started it all. Italy wanted its name back. In 2009, the campaign reached its peak. Neapolitan pizza making, the art of the pizzaiolo, was submitted to UNESCO for recognition as an intangible cultural heritage of humanity. The application took 8 years. 8 years of lobbying, documentation, cultural arguments, and in 2017 UNESCO agreed. The craft was inscribed on the list. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains everything about how far this food has traveled. The same nation whose northern newspapers once called pizza a disgusting habit of the Neapolitan poor was now presenting that exact tradition to the United Nations as a treasure of human civilization. The shame had been fully, officially, permanently reversed, not because the recipe changed, but because the world changed around it. Naples felt that reversal in real, material ways. Tourism surged. Pizzerias that had been family operations for 3 or 4 generations suddenly had lines stretching around the block. Not locals, but visitors from Tokyo, Sao Paulo, Sydney, Los Angeles, all clutching guidebooks, all wanting the authentic experience. A plate of dough, tomato, and cheese that once cost a few pennies and carried social stigma was now a destination. But here's what strikes me most about this whole story. Pizza didn't conquer the world because someone marketed it brilliantly or because a corporation decided it was the next big thing. It conquered the world because hungry people needed something cheap, fast, and filling, and they figured it out on cramped streets with wood-fired ovens and whatever they could afford. That's it. That's the whole engine. A flatbread that Roman poets would have recognized. A tomato that Europeans were afraid to eat for 200 years. A piece of mozzarella pulled from the milk of water buffalo grazing in southern Italian marshland. Put them together on a weeknight in 18th century Naples, and you get a meal that aristocrats literally held their noses at. Put them together today, and you get a $300 billion global industry. The distance between those two realities, the gutter and the gold, is not a story about food. It's a story about who gets to decide what matters. For centuries, the answer was, not the poor, not the immigrants, not the people actually doing the cooking. The ones who decided were the ones who never had to eat pizza because they had nothing else. Then the world shifted. Soldiers came home craving it. Suburban families ordered it on Friday nights. College kids survived on it. A generation of children grew up believing pizza was as American as anything on the table. And somewhere in that transformation, the original shame just evaporated. Nobody remembered it. Nobody cared. Right now, Tonight, somewhere in Naples, a pizzaiuolo is sliding a margherita into an oven that has been burning in the same spot for longer than most countries have existed. Somewhere in New York, a guy is folding a slice in half and eating it over a paper plate on a sidewalk. Somewhere in Tokyo, a chef is placing microgreens on a wood-fired crust and calling it artisan. Every single one of them is holding the same thing, a food that was once considered too low, too crude, too poor to even mention in polite company. It is sitting in your refrigerator right now, or in a box on your counter, or in a menu you've bookmarked on your phone, and it got there through centuries of poverty, snobbery, migration, reinvention, and stubbornness, mostly stubbornness. If any part of that journey surprised you, hit subscribe. We tell a story like this every week, one ordinary thing that turned out to be anything but, and drop a comment. Which part of pizza's history caught you the most off guard? I'd genuinely like to know.